For centuries, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side in Baghdad, Aleppo, and Jerusalem under a single empire. Then, in 1916, two European diplomats drew a line through all of it. Most people blame religion for why the Middle East keeps breaking apart. But if diversity was not the problem, what was? The answer is a chain of structural failures, and it starts with a collapse most people skip over entirely. Difference alone never made the Middle East ungovernable. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire managed a region more diverse than most modern states, home to Muslims, Christians, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, and many others. The empire's solution was not forced sameness, but a legal framework called the millet system. Each recognized religious community ran its own courts, schools, and charities, while remaining under the Sultan's rule. In cities like Aleppo, Baghdad, and Jerusalem, this meant neighbors could follow different laws, worship in their own way, and still share a common urban life. In Aleppo, around 1901, for example, Muslims made up about 70% of the city, Christians 23%, and Jews 7%. Baghdad's 1918 census recorded roughly 61% Muslims, 33% Jews, and 6% Christians. Jerusalem before World War I was about three-quarters Muslim, with significant Christian and Jewish minorities. These arrangements did not erase difference, they contained it. The system depended on a strong imperial center. When the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros on October 30, 1918, its authority collapsed almost overnight. The Young Turk leaders fled, ministries stopped functioning, and the old order unraveled. Without the empire's legal and security institutions, local policing broke down. Banditry spread, old grievances resurfaced, and communities that once coexisted began to fear for their safety. The glue that had held a plural society together was gone, and the region entered an era of uncertainty. What filled that vacuum and how would shape the fate of the Middle East for generations. Diplomats in London and Paris sat at tables covered in maps, not census rolls. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement drew fresh lines across the Ottoman remnants, dividing the region into British and French spheres of influence. The goal was not local coherence, but strategic advantage, control of ports like Haifa and Alexandretta, secure routes to India, and access to oil fields in Mosul. The mapmakers gave little thought to the patchwork of languages, religions, and histories on the ground. Instead, they prioritized what would serve distant capitals and their imperial ambitions. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, these lines became international law. Britain took mandates over Palestine and Mesopotamia, while France claimed Syria and Lebanon. The new borders split some communities and forced others together. Kurds, for example, found their homeland divided between Turkey to Syria, Uruk, and eventually Iran. Armenians, already displaced by war and genocide, were scattered again. Assyrians and Yazidis became minorities inside newly invented states, often with little protection or recognition. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 cemented these arrangements, erasing earlier promises of autonomy for Kurds and Armenians. The map was set, but the challenge was only beginning. These new states inherited borders shaped by outside interests, not by the lived realities of their people. Inside each, leaders faced a daunting task: how to forge loyalty and a sense of belonging among populations who had not chosen to share a flag. The lines on paper were now real, but the bonds of citizenship would take much longer to draw. And as these states struggled to invent national identities, the seeds of future conflict were quietly sown. In the years after new borders were drawn, rulers across the Middle East faced a daunting challenge: how to govern societies that had not chosen to share a flag. Many leaders, whether monarchs or military strongmen, chose control over consensus. Instead of building inclusive institutions, they built security states. In Syria and Iraq, the Ba'ath Party centralized power through sprawling intelligence networks and loyal military elites. The Syrian General Intelligence Directorate, for example, became the backbone of the regime, keeping watch not just on foreign threats, but on citizens themselves. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein's web of overlapping security agencies reported directly to the presidency, each one designed to check the others and prevent rivals from rising. Monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan forged a different bargain. Oil wealth or foreign aid funded generous patronage systems, buying loyalty through jobs, subsidies, and contracts. In exchange, elites and tribal leaders supported the crown, while security forces kept a close grip on dissent. Egypt's military republics followed a similar path, with the armed forces doubling as both protectors and business empires. This approach delivered order, at least on the surface, but it came at a cost. Civil society remained weak, and the rule of law often bent to serve those in power. When crisis struck, these states looked stable, but proved brittle. The real test would come when outside shocks and mass unrest arrived, exposing just how thin the foundations really were. In late 2010, a single act of protest in Tunisia set off a chain reaction. Street vendors, students, and workers flooded public squares from Tunis to Cairo, demanding dignity and accountability. But these demonstrations were less a cause than a stress test, a way to reveal the strength or weakness of the states beneath. In Tunisia, the government's existing institutions, though far from perfect, could negotiate. Political parties bargained, civil society groups joined the debate, and after months of tension, a new constitution was drafted through compromise. The result was not chaos, but a fragile, negotiated transition. Elsewhere, the same wave of protest struck much thinner walls. In Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the state's ability to absorb pressure was shallow. Security forces cracked down, opposition groups splintered, and what began as protest quickly spiraled into armed conflict. In Syria, leaked communications from 2011 and 2012 show opposition leaders unable to form a unified council, while regime forces escalated with force. Libya's central security apparatus collapsed almost overnight, unleashing a scramble among militias. Yemen's tribal structures fractured, opening the door to civil war. The dividing line was not the presence of unrest, but the depth of the state's institutions, the capacity to bargain, adapt, and channel crisis into reform. Where that depth existed, pressure produced change. Where it was missing, the same pressure led to breakdown. The Arab Spring did not invent instability. It exposed which states could survive the shock and which would fracture under its weight. But the story didn't stop there. As these cracks widened, outside actors began to pour in, raising the stakes even higher. Civil wars in the Middle East quickly became arenas for outside competition. In Syria and Yemen, Saudi Arabia and Iran fueled the fighting by sending money, weapons, and advisors to rival factions. Saudi support for Sunni groups and Iranian backing for Shia-aligned forces hardened divisions and made peace elusive. In Yemen, Iranian missiles and drones reached the Houthis, while Saudi airstrikes and blockades devastated infrastructure. These interventions turned local disputes into grinding proxy wars with no easy end in sight. Elsewhere, foreign intervention created new vacuums. The 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq toppled Saddam Hussein, but dissolving the Iraqi army and purging Ba'ath officials left over 400,000 soldiers jobless. Armed groups and sectarian militias filled the void, sparking years of instability. Libya's 2011 NATO intervention removed Gaddafi, but no central command replaced him. Competing militias and tribes scrambled for control, and the state faded away. Removing regimes proved far simpler than building states. Regional patrons and foreign militaries could tip the balance, but rarely stayed to rebuild. The result? Longer wars, deeper fragmentation, and a region fractured by proxy rivalries. Oil wealth has long promised stability, but the reality is more complicated. In Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, hydrocarbon revenues account for over half of government income, funding public jobs, generous subsidies, and expansive security forces. This flow of money allows rulers to offer material benefits without relying on broad-based taxes. But when governments do not need to tax their citizens, they often become less accountable to them. Patronage networks, jobs, contracts, and cash grants can buy time and delay unrest, yet they rarely address the root causes of fragility. When oil prices crash, even the wealthiest states are forced to cut spending, revealing how quickly the system can come under strain. Meanwhile, countries without significant oil, like Jordan or Lebanon, face chronic deficits and must depend on foreign aid, limiting their options even further. The region's economic order is built on a double-edged bargain. Wealth creates capacity, but it can also hollow out the foundations needed for lasting resilience. The next layer of the story reveals how these pressures interact with deeper social and environmental challenges. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has cast a long shadow over regional politics since the early 20th century. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in November 1917, Britain pledged support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also promising to protect the civil and religious rights of existing communities. This dual commitment set the stage for decades of contestation. Across the Middle East, the Palestinian cause became a powerful force in public opinion, shaping how leaders positioned themselves both at home and abroad. Governments and political movements often invoked the conflict to rally support or justify policy, making it a common thread in the speeches and demonstrations from Cairo to Tehran. Yet, while its influence is real and enduring, the conflict alone does not explain every episode of state collapse or fragmentation. It is one pressure among many, always present, sometimes decisive, but never the sole driver. To understand why the region keeps breaking apart, the story must move beyond any single cause. Nearly 2/3 of people in the Middle East are under 30, and in many countries, youth unemployment hovers above 20%. When jobs and political outlets are scarce, frustration gathers in fast-growing cities. Water scarcity adds pressure. The drought from 2007 to 2010 in Syria forced hundreds of thousands to leave their land, while the Tigris-Euphrates, Jordan, and Yemen's aquifers struggle to keep pace with demand. These forces do not cause collapse alone, but when weak institutions meet demographic and environmental strain, the risk of fragmentation rises. States with deeper bureaucracies and real bargaining, where the rule of law is more than a slogan, weather shocks better than those built around a single ruler. The difference between adaptation and fracture is rarely about any one crisis, but about how many pressures hit at once, and whether the political system can manage them all. Instability here is not fate. It is the fallout of overlapping pressures still playing out today. As rivalries, fragile institutions, and resource stress intensify, the stakes reach far beyond any one border. The region's future hinges not on old divisions, but on whether new frameworks can finally hold. What do you think?